Gotta tell you, I've been thinking a lot about my mom and dad this week. I don't know why. Perhaps it's the transition to fall or anticipating this season of holidays and milestones without them. I don't know. But I notice that even now, as I continue to adjust to the fact of their absence, that I'm always coming into a new appreciation of all that their presence meant. I've been thinking about the gifts that they gave to me and the wisdom that they passed along simply by the way that they were themselves in the world. And I realize that sometimes I try to think of them like the kind of list of aphorisms, like the one we just heard from the Apostle Paul, like all the things that he had learned from his life and mission and wanted to preserve for them who were not yet so far down the road of faith. I really love this message paraphrase that we've just heard and how its pithy directives offer us such a fresh perspective on Paul's insights. There are so many gems here, a whole series of sermons, but today we're only going to focus on my favorite among them, which is be inventive in hospitality. Now that too makes me think of my parents. Both my mom and dad, as anyone who knew them could confirm, were the consummate hosts. In big and small ways, it was always their impulse to welcome others, from "Why don't you come in and have a cup of tea?" to "Sure, your niece can absolutely stay with us for 2 months while she completes her internship." Kristen Van Ogtrop of the Washington Post calls this having the Airbnb gene. When the family needed a spot to gather, when the youth group wanted a place to have a pool party, when the Hood to Coast team visiting from New Jersey needed to crash for the night between legs of the run, when the down-on-her-luck church friend needed a shoulder to cry on, the yes always came so easily for them. "Why not?" my dad would say whenever I asked why this was all necessary, as if the outlay of energy and inconvenience needed no explanation. Now, that is not to say that things were always easy in our house of hospitality. It was not, and the instructive to bear one's cross we often hear in the gospel is applicable here as well. Such a commitment to welcome required investment and some amount of discomfort, and certainly an openness to learning. My parents kept 2 4x8 sheets of plywood in the laundry room of our apartment in New York City all year long. Their purpose was not home repair. Rather, they were to lay on top of our existing dining table in order to increase the size so as to accommodate the growing crowds at their Thanksgiving feast. What had started as a way to welcome a few friends from the neighborhood who didn't have family to celebrate had grown to about 50 folks that would tumble in the door every year on the 3rd Thursday of November, leaving their winter coats in an enormous mountain on one of the beds. And I know that there were years that, once they left, my mother swore that next year we were going to a restaurant. Because she was never cooking for that many people again. It was hard. Lots of times folks outstayed their welcome. Oftentimes they left a mess. But the very next year, October would roll around and the attitude would have subtly shifted back to, why not? There were other times when unexpected guests would come along to some dinner that was already in the works, and my mother would bustle around whispering one of her signature phrases in our ear, which was, FHB, FHB. It stood for Family Hold Back. And we all knew it meant she was worried there wouldn't be enough lasagna or whatever thing, and that when we went through the buffet line, we were meant to take only a tiny bit of whatever had been prepared for dinner, pretending that we had become birds rather than the ravenous adolescent lions that we were. When my parents' business colleagues would visit with their wives and children from Japan, there had to be a reckoning in the pantry. Rice-a-roni, it turned out, which was fine for us, was not what was needed or wanted by our guests. And so my parents would always set off to explore new markets and new parts of town in order to find ways to procure ingredients that would make everyone feel at home. And when the gluten-free vegans moved in next door, new recipes had to be added to the hosting repertoire so everyone would have something that they knew was safe and filling. And a lot of those sound like small things, but you would not believe the number of people that have been in touch with me in the last months and years to say, I always knew I was welcome in your parents' house, and that was such a gift. And watching all this as a bystander, I feel I did learn something of what this worship series is aiming to invite us to discuss. Come to the table. And that is that there is more to Christian hospitality, more to our sacramental practice of table fellowship than simply feeding people a morsel of bread and a sip of juice. There is more than saying, this is the body of Christ, so go on and do what you will. That there is a difference between being given food and being fed. And I think this series invites us to think about how the invitation of the gospel is actually to be part of an endless process of working to make the table always a bit wider, carving out a few more spaces, and then a few more, and then a few more, so that the feast is perpetually growing and being changed, and so all those who come can find the nourishment that they need. For a welcome is not really a welcome, is it, if those who are invited cannot get fed? Or if all the songs we sing at the table are unfamiliar? Or if their bodies don't fit in the place that we've set for them? So I think the calling is more than to feed, it's to grow and to be inventive in our hospitality, always learning to modulate our own needs so everyone can get what they want. And I think that might sound easy and sound like something we're all naturally in favor of, but I'm not sure it actually really is. I think it can actually be difficult, not only because change and expansion are naturally uncomfortable, but because the church will always have a strong pull toward thinking that what we believe in this moment, toward thinking that what we have done recently are eternal and therefore unchangeable. We tend to forget, although the gospel would be quick to remind us, that what is eternal is only God, not our own human habits. And that because God is also limitless, there is always room for our own evolutions, always a summons to consider what more might be needed, and to extend the welcome that God has extended to us in the person of Jesus. And when you get right into it, it's not easy, it's hard. Jesus knew that. He was always talking about welcome and come one more, but he was also always talking about crosses and suffering and bearing your difficulties. Remember that part? He was always talking about giving stuff away and being kind of uncomfortable. And I think what he meant is, if it isn't at least a little hard, this whole faith thing, this whole community life thing, if you're not at least a little challenged, if you're not at least a little bit uncomfortable, then you're not really doing it. You're not really leaning into the transformative endeavor to which you have been invited by God in the life of Jesus. Right? Jesus' whole being, his whole presence, his whole ministry was an invitation to believe that God is with us, and that God welcomed us, and that God's table was open and waiting and eagerly anticipating each and every one of us. I think a huge part of spirituality and the Christian faith about learning to lean into those truths, to drink in those ideas, to make them the place from which we step out into the world. But there's a whole nother part that we don't want to miss that's about acting through God's just as excited, acting as though God is just as excited about every other person joining the feast. And we accept Jesus' invitation. Part of saying, yes, why not, is a consent to be changed and to engage in this work and to see things differently. We are welcome at God's table, but we are also charged to welcome the table, to welcome what it means to be in relationship and to widen our sense of belonging until everyone has a place. And I want to be precise here. I'm not talking about evangelism. I'm not talking about let's get more people in here. I'm not talking about let's get some more folding chairs. When we start talking about let's get more people in here, that's usually a sign that we are getting our own needs met rather than meeting the needs of those that might come. I'm talking about where are the pockets of hunger around us that we might try to meet? Physical maybe, but also spiritual. I'm talking about where is there a thirst for belonging that we might slake? Where is there an opportunity for transformation or togetherness? Who hasn't had a chance to feel at home yet? And what can we do about that? It's not about growing numerically. It's about growing spiritually, about growing in wisdom and understanding and openness and joy and generosity. And it's about watching our own selves be transformed and deepened by that sharing. And I'm telling you all this because I want some of that to be our work together this year as a church. To look around and think where we could squeeze in a few more places, see who's here and who's not here. To make a commitment to be willing to scoot over, to scoot down, to share our slice of pie in service to having a more full and joyful and holy celebration at God's table. And I also want to be clear, this isn't just about food, and it might not be about that for you. You do not have to have 50 people over for Thanksgiving. Do not walk away from this sermon believing that. That was my parents' calling. But certainly there must be places in your mind or in your heart or in your home or your community where there's room for growth, where there's room for welcome, where there's room for belonging. Maybe you're into music and it's time to open yourself to a broader palette. Maybe it's social action and this year is the year to go out on a limb for a cause that you really believe in and bring some of us along with you. Maybe it's expanding your social circle to include more folks who look differently or live differently or think differently than you. Maybe it's a conversation we have as a church to think about what do we have room for and who might need to come. Remembering that it may cost us and it may be uncomfortable for us to pursue what God has called us to. We may need to go looking hard for new resources to do that work, but it's how we grow. It's how we thrive. It's how we are inventive in our hospitality. It's how we fight the evil in this world by doing good upon good upon good. And so I offer those invitations and questions and ideas saying, may it be so for us in this season and always. May we be inventive together. Amen. We are invited to respond